Market Journal, television for agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine.
Hello everyone, I'm Troy Moling, and thank you for joining us this week on Market Journal. Glad you could spend a little bit of your day with us. Beginning our broadcast today, earlier this month, the United States Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit issued a ruling immediately canceling the registration of 3 products primarily used in dicamba-resistant soybean. The question is, how will this affect farmers, applicators, and others? On Tuesday, I spoke with UNL agricultural law professor Terry Centner to get the latest.
Okay, the 3 products are XtendiMax, Engenia and FeXapan, and these are 3 herbicides to kill weeds that were developed by Bayer Crop Science, BASF, and Corteva. And what they do and why they are important is they can be applied to soybeans and cotton after the plants are up. So often herbicides have to be applied before the plants are up, but because we have specially genetically modified seeds that can tolerate this herbicide, they can be sprayed up to 45 days for soybeans after the soybeans have been planted.
How have things progressed since the news last week to where we are here on Tuesday morning?
Well, a lot has happened in a week. As most people know, on June 3rd, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals in the West Coast vacated the 3 registrations for the herbicides I've just mentioned. With that court order, state departments of agriculture responded to say, well, the herbicides have not been canceled, the registrations have not been canceled, so we're going to allow them to be used. However, on June 8th, 2020, the EPA issued its final order canceling the registrations for these 3 pesticides. And so what this means is they cannot be sold or marketed or moved in interstate commerce because of this court order. But the court order went further, and we can talk about that a little later. But it's important to realize that the action by the Environmental Protection Agency overrides state orders.
And yeah, just give us a quick explainer as to why the EPA made the move to do this final cancellation order, because it mentions adverse effects to human health and the environment. And it seems like all herbicides may kind of fall under those categories. So why would these 3? Anything you can expound on there?
Well, this is an interesting question and why it's hard to know how to regulate pesticides or herbicides, because as you mentioned, all of them have some negative effects. And so the question basically becomes the evidence. What scientific evidence is there about how many adverse effects there are? And if there are too many adverse effects, then of course we're going to have to do something about it, and that would be to cancel the registration, or more likely the pesticide would never become registered if there were too many adverse effects. So the adverse effects for these 3 herbicides were the drift damages, basically, that they were harming vegetation and other crops. And we were aware of this from the beginning. We thought it could be minimized, and unfortunately, the first year the herbicides were used, it was not minimized. So the EPA and actually the manufacturers worked together to come up with additional regulations limiting when the herbicides could be used so that would cut down on the drift damages. And I think that these new ideas that were implemented in 2018 and then again in 2019 were helpful. They reduced the damages, but unfortunately they did not reduce them enough. And so there were continuing to be a lot of damages to neighboring vegetation and crops. We actually don't have a good figure of how much damage there was, although there was enough damage that there was some community angst, and this was mentioned by the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeal, that farmers that were not using the GMO seeds were upset because their crops were being damaged by their neighbors, and yet they didn't want to complain about their neighbors. And there was considerable dissatisfaction by State Department of Agriculture in the expenses that they had to expend to look into all of the complaints. With the skyrocketing complaints, State Departments of Agriculture, or that agency that's in charge of registration of pesticides in that state, are expected to look into complaints. And they were expending way too many resources looking into the complaints from these 3 herbicide products.
And you mentioned it before. I think it's important to hammer home that what the EPA says is going to supersede what any state department says, like the Nebraska Department of Agriculture, for instance. Are there any other impacts that Nebraska producers need to understand or be aware of, how this ruling impacts them?
Yes, the ruling, or actually it's the EPA final order that is impacting us, because that involves the cancellation of these 3 herbicides. And the EPA very explicitly outlined what to do with outstanding stocks. And this was a big concern for producers and for commercial applicators of herbicides. And so the EPA had these ideas in mind because similar thing happened in 2015 when the court ordered the insecticide sulfoxaflor to be vacated. And so the EPA canceled that registration in 2015. And basically, the EPA is following that procedure in 2020 with the cancellation of these 3 herbicides. So under the cancellation order that was issued on June 8th, producers can continue to use their stocks of these herbicides up until July 31st. So this is good news for producers. They don't have to return them, although they can return them, and they can use them to control weeds as planned. And presumably they should be able to use up all of their stocks, because you can use these herbicides for about 45 days after the seeds were planted. And hopefully all our soybean seeds would be planted by June 16th, and we could then use these herbicides up to July 31st as allowed under the Environmental Protection Agency's final order. I also noted that we can return the stocks to manufacturers, and so that is a possibility for producers, and it's also a possibility for commercial applicators. Commercial applicators are a separate category, and they are also able to apply these herbicides up until July 31st. After that date, it's illegal, and it's also illegal for applicators or producers to sell or distribute them or move them to other people at this time.
Thanks again to Terry. Lots of moving pieces with this, and we will be sure and continue to track this story. Time for markets now, and on Tuesday morning I was joined by Derrell Peel. Derrell is our livestock analyst from Oklahoma State University, and the beef processing sector continues its recovery since the COVID shutdown. Let's get a look at the timeline to how we got here.
Well, you know, obviously through the month of April, we got worse and worse as COVID swept through these packing plants and affected the labor forces. We bottomed out right at the end of April, first couple of days of May, and then we've been in recovery mode since then. And we've actually made very dramatic recovery in terms of the beef packing plants and in general, I think, across most of the meat industries. You know, we're back up. The estimated daily slaughter, the most recent number that I saw, actually showed us about 98% of a year ago. So we're back very close to full capacity.
What do you see as some of the biggest challenges that are still ahead for us?
Well, I think, you know, you can look at it from two sides. From the consumer side, I think we're past the worst of it. So we did have the disruptions in supply. We had shortages that showed up in the grocery stores and, you know, all of that stuff. And that's really past now. We shouldn't see any more problems with that unless we have some sort of major setback. The problems still exist on the live cattle side. The feedlot side, obviously, we created a significant backlog through this process of cattle that did not get harvested on in a timely way. And so we're going to spend some time time here, probably much of the summer at least, working our way to back to a more current situation and getting caught up on those supplies.
What do you think the situation has revealed about beef pricing and supply and demand? Maybe things that we weren't completely aware of before?
Well, I think that's a good way to put it. I think we've learned a lot about how markets really work. Markets do what they do most of the time in a fairly subtle way, and I think we take it for granted a lot of times. We're able to take it for granted. And with the massive shocks like we've seen this time, I think we've learned a lot about, sort of how markets really work. Markets have dealt with these shocks. You can look at the disruptions and so on, but on the other hand, we've really handled it fairly well. Now, in the process of doing that, we've seen some things that I think some people really weren't expecting to see. We've had some reactions that maybe markets were not working. In fact, from my standpoint, I would say these markets are working exactly as we would expect them to. And you get some of the kinds of surprises that we've had in terms of, wholesale prices going up at the same time that fed cattle prices are going down. And that's exactly what happens in a margin type industry, a marketing margin situation, when the marketing margin in the middle between those two markets changes.
And Derrell, you've studied these markets, you've studied cattle for a long time. What are some things that you personally have learned over the past few months?
Well, I think we've all sort of gotten to see kind of under the hood here, again, of how these markets work. And we've also learned a lot about the fact that these markets are very complex. I sort of knew that, but every day you learn something new. And certainly these markets have revealed, when we get into the product side especially, that there's a vast array of products. We've learned a lot about the two sort of major components of our food industry in terms of the food service sector and the retail grocery sector. I don't think we really appreciated how specialized those were. They're incredibly efficient at what they do, but we've also learned that they're a little bit vulnerable when we have this kind of disruption. So we've learned a little bit about some of the rigidities that exist in these markets, and that's, I guess, some of the trade-off we have for the kind of very efficient, very streamlined supply chains that we utilize in this country.
And let's look at export numbers real quick before we wrap up. Wanted to get a check on those, and you just wrote an article breaking down the data on some of our major protein exports. Any highlights on that you'd like to share?
Well, overall, if you look at the month of April, beef exports were actually down slightly year over year. We're up for the year. The beef imports were fractionally lower than last year in April, but they are up slightly for the year. But as we go forward, we're really expecting, modest strength in the export side. It varies a little bit by country, but we're expecting the overall trade picture to be fairly positive. In a broader protein sense, China is such a major driver of these markets. We expected that coming into the year, and even though there have been lots of COVID impacts in the Chinese economy and in other economies around the world, we still think that will be a major driver. So our pork exports continue extremely strong. We're exporting some broiler meat to China now, and our beef exports to China, even though they're fairly small yet, they are only about 1% of our total exports, they are growing, and we expect to see some growth in those as we go forward.
And Derrell, we'll end it today with any final marketing or risk management advice. And you can never really predict for the unknown, but how do you try to ensure some type of profit in these uncertain times?
Well, obviously it's a big challenge. Nobody really anticipated coming into the year that we would experience the kinds of things we've had. So it's been very much a year where we're kind of on the defensive. I think certainly any sort of aggressive plans we had are kind of shelved right now. We're trying to find a way to get through this and maybe minimize the damages. In some cases, at least, is more the strategy at this point. But that said, as we go forward, we're starting to think a little bit past the immediate sort of public health concerns, not to say that they're over yet, but now we're starting to really kind of focus on the recovery mode. At some point, there will be some opportunities. So, producers need to be kind of on the defensive, try to figure out financially how to get through this and survive it, first of all, but then, try to position yourself where you can take advantage of some opportunities that are going to come eventually. It's not clear yet whether they will happen yet in 2020 or whether we're looking beyond 2020, but there certainly will be some brighter days ahead.
Thanks to Derrell for joining us this week. Also of concern to cattle producers, warmer weather making a return to Nebraska. And if you're hot, there's a good chance your animals are too. And the more time cattle spend trying to stay cool, the less time they spend eating, growing, and making you profits. We spoke with an expert to get his advice on what you can do. One hot topic during the scorching summer months is finding the best way to keep your cattle cool. According to Animal Environment Extension Specialist Dr. Rick Stowell, when the mercury rises, a cow's love for eating takes a back seat to finding ways to beat the heat.
What this means for the producer is that it'll take longer for them to get up to the desired body weight to sell them or market them. And this means that their feed efficiency will go down and feed costs for that same product will go up. And for the cow-calf operation, what they face is that it's harder to get cows pregnant and keep them pregnant when it's hot out. And so there's extra breeding costs associated with that, and there's potential costs of keeping a cow that's open or not pregnant. Do they maintain that cow or do they sell it?
Stowell says using the temperature-humidity index can help determine how hot and uncomfortable your cattle are. Research shows when the THI is about 75, cattle may be at risk for heat stress. Keeping an eye on the dew point is good practice too.
Dew point temperature doesn't vary throughout the day like temperature and humidity do, but if the dew point temperature is getting in the upper 60s or into the 70s, we can be pretty sure that cattle are going to be impacted.
As far as symptoms for cattle that are exhibiting heat stress, it's important to look for panting and an increased respiration rate.
If we think about the dog days of summer, how do dogs behave when it gets hot and sticky? They will start panting, they'll start slobbering around, mouth open. And we don't want cattle to do that normally. Cattle aren't designed like dogs, but they will start having those behaviors. They will start breathing fast, panting, and when they're under stress, they will have open mouth breathing and kind of slobbering with their tongue out.
And even on especially hot days, you can sometimes still catch a breeze. That's why Dr. Stowell offers the reminder to keep your cattle's pen free from obstructions so air can pass through. You may also want to provide portable water and shade that can be moved as the animals do. And adjust your schedule to limit heat stress on the animals as much as possible.
When do we feed and handle cattle? We want to feed and handle cattle early in the morning. And if we don't need to handle cattle when it's hot, push that back and try to keep that extra stress for a time when they're not under heat stress.
This heat isn't anything to play around with, we all know that. So make sure your cattle have plenty of water on hand and maybe even have some extra water too if they need it. That wouldn't be a bad idea. We've posted a link to the temperature humidity index on the Market Journal website. Next up, for Scott Gonerman, the term no-till doesn't quite cut it for describing his farming operation. He says the term zero disturbance might be more fitting. You see, since 2008, Gonerman, who farms near Waco, has abided by his zero disturbance ideology, only disturbing the soil with his planter's openers. He started planting single-species cover crops that winter killed in 2009, followed by multiple species mixes that included more winter-hardy cover crops in 2010. He continues to expand his rotation and is in the process of adding more perennials like alfalfa. For Gonerman, it's about net profit spread across the whole rotation. You can read about how Gonerman has profited from these methods in the June Nebraska Farmer. Time now for weather with Nebraska Extension Ag Climatologist and Market Journal Chief Meteorologist Al Dutcher. And Al, when it gets hot out there, we need to be prepared for it too. How are things looking?
Well, Troy, you're exactly right. These hot temperatures are a warning to us to take extra precaution, especially as our dew points have been rising up into the rather uncomfortable levels as we start to see temperatures rising up in the 90s and dew points above 70. We can get some pretty significant heat stress built up, particularly not only on humans, but of course our animals out there. And I think the biggest thing for us was the wind was able to offset some of those conditions. But boy, was it sure a miserable period here with these long stretch of hot temperatures, a lot of wind. And unfortunately, a lot of severe weather. This is probably our biggest severe weather that we've seen in a considerable amount of time. we've seen at least 5 tornadoes and over 120 wind events alone since the beginning of the month. So we are now in officially severe weather season. And really what is in store as we go forward in time will make a big difference in how this crops turn out as we go through this remainder of this month. So let's go to the upper air models and see what we can expect. Today's upper air pattern features a large upper air low, once again, the Pacific Northwest, and a ridge downstream over the Central Plains, bringing the warmth right back to us after a couple days of coolness. At the surface is a low in northwestern portions of Kansas that may inhibit, or it will basically try to get some thunderstorm activity developed in the western panhandle, but that's probably as far as it's going to go, and they'll be very isolated at best. As we go into tomorrow, we'll see that that trough starts to pivot toward the northern Rockies, shows surface low developing in portions of southeastern Wyoming, and another one down deep Texas. There's just not a lot of moisture feed up northward to create much more than a few scattered thunderstorms once again in the panhandle. And by the time we get to Monday, we start to see that trough in the upper atmosphere broaden out. And as it broadens out, we'll see low pressure developing in portions of northwest Kansas, and that may help to keep some of the moisture going in western Nebraska into the morning hours. But more importantly, we'll start to see some precipitation to the east of us, but not much in the way here in Nebraska as we stay under these warm temperatures, probably doing a little bit more wind by Tuesday. Not much change in that jet stream pattern. Still the development of a surface low in northwestern portions of Kansas and up in northwestern Nebraska, but the main precipitation looks like it's going to remain up over the northern Rockies. We'll keep under these warm conditions through the midweek period at least, as that trough doesn't really move much. We still see those lows at the surface developing in southwestern Kansas and eastern portions of Wyoming, but most of that moisture is being lifted up into the northern plains far shy of our region as high pressure is firmly in control. Thursday, we see another piece of energy slip into that broad trough and deepen it over the Rockies. That starts to set up the surface lows over the Great Basin and starts to eject that energy out toward the northern plains. And we start to see some moisture returns in Montana and the western Dakotas as we go into next Thursday. And then we see that trough really deepen next Friday. That's going to span warmth all the way across the eastern half of the country. Low pressure starts to set up in the Nebraska Panhandle. We had the opportunity to actually generate some pretty significant moisture across the northern plains. And some of this is probably going to make it into western Nebraska. More importantly, as we go forward in time, we look at the 8 to 14 day forecast, including next Thursday to the following Tuesday, we can see that that upper air low looks like it's going to stay positioned somewhere around the northern plains with below normal temperatures and above normal everywhere else. And in terms of precipitation, we start to see a return of above normal moisture. Most of this is in the period outside of our forecast, basically that Sunday through Tuesday time period when this trough starts to broaden out and shoots energy into our region. So overall, it's looking like a little better later in the period, but right now we just don't have significant moisture moving it into the region anytime into the near future. So Troy, overall, we're going to return back to the heat with very little in the opportunity for precipitation for the next 10 days, unfortunately.
Thanks, Al. Finally today, mint may not sound like a crop you'd find in Nebraska. That's because it typically isn't. But there's a program at the Panhandle Research and Extension Center that's finding out whether farmers could grow it commercially in the Midwest. Market Journal's Maddie McIntosh has more.
Most Nebraska farmers would never have thought of growing mint as a crop in their system. Dr. Dipak Santra, an alternative crops breeding specialist with Nebraska Extension, is researching to find the best varieties to grow right here in the heartland.
At present, most of the mint is in Pacific Northwest. And also it is being grown Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, but not that scale. The majority, probably 60-70% of the mint is being grown in Pacific Northwest. And there are primarily two different types of mint. Peppermint is imported, and spearmint is native of North America. So it production started in the eastern part of the country, then it moved, it found its better home, which is ideal weather, ideal climate in that Pacific Northwest.
Dr. Santra says the project idea began when an Idaho mint farmer came to him with questions. That's when he realized the potential and began his research.
We started this project using 14 different clones, primarily 6 peppermint, 6 spearmint, and 2 were intermediate. So idea was 3 aspects. One is which variety is best adaptable here, because they need to adapt this climate, they need to grow on time, they need to develop a proper biomass, all these things. then how much biomass they are yielding, and then oil content. Now, with oil content, there was not much different with oil content, except to tell that there are two major type of oil in peppermint and spearmint, because their end use are different, their market use is different. So if you think it's the same mint oil, that is not the case. There are a bunch of mint oils. It's a group of aromatic compounds, and each type has a specific oil, but the majority, 90+% of total 10 or more different types is that two different specific type for two specific mint varieties.
Besides finding the right variety, there are other obstacles producers would face when growing commercially, including processing.
The major bottlenecks in order to move forward with a large-scale mint production is probably processing plant. You need to cut it and you need to process right away. Now, every farmer, they are not equipped with this. We do not have any commercial processing plant so that farmers harvest it and take the fresh biomass directly to the processing plant and let them handle that. Another thing is the market, like what is the demand, supply, all these things, because we are not the major player. It is not a bad idea to diversify your farm if you have the resources. Resources means probably if you have people. So there are a bunch of factors are there. So definitely it has potential. If somebody is interested, I would recommend that start with 100 acre and 200 acre before you jump into 1,000 plus acres. There is some challenges, but definitely it has a potential. Hopefully, a couple of more farmers will grow, particularly the small acreage farmers and who want to diversify their farms with different types of crops.
Reporting for Market Journal, I'm Maddie McIntosh.
The next step is to find ways to optimize nitrogen fertilizer for the crop. That research will continue on through 2020. That's going to do it for this week's show. If you missed a story, be sure to download the Market Journal mobile app or follow us on social media so you can join in on the conversation. And don't forget, you can get the latest updates on the coronavirus outbreak at covid19.unl.edu. Hope to see you right back here next time. I'm Troy Moling. Thanks for watching.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources.